we've never experienced such peace.
Yeah.
Like, it might feel like that, and a lot of that is what you're consuming, like, your internal environment, and then also your external environment that a lot of us are just choosing to put ourselves in. Like, you're throwing yourself into Twitter for 4 hours a day, then you think everything is on fire. Well, no, like, close your laptop, turn off your phone, and go walk outside, and you'll realize that reality is much different than the actual one that's being experienced by most people.
I completely agree. I mean,
Hello, everybody. You're listening to Chatting with Candice. I'm your host, Candice Horbacz. Before we jump into the episode, if you could do me a solid favor and just hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening or watching. And if you are listening on Apple, if you could take a second to leave a 5-star review, that helps a ton with the algorithm and just kind of showing up in searchability and in the charts. It would mean the world to me. If you want to support the podcast, you can go to chattingwithcandice.com, and there are a couple of ways that you can do it from there, whether it's buy me a coffee or the Patreon account. That just helps me get bigger and better guests. We're trying to do more in person, so that's really exciting. Thank you for being on this podcast journey with me. So without further ado, please help me welcome James Esses. James, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I was really excited to have you on because this is still kind of a taboo topic, which I'm sure we'll kind of get into. But I guess to start the listeners off, do you want to give them some of your background, who you are, and a little bit of your story?
sure. Thanks for having me on. It's nice to be chatting. So, yeah, I've been campaigning, writing, commentating on gender, ideology, and what's happening in relation to children and women for a few years now. I was training to be a therapist. That was what I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing, and then I became aware of what was going on in the world in relation to gender ideology. I started to speak out about it and write about it, and ultimately that cost me my future career. And I was expelled from my master's degree. I'm now having to bring legal action against my former institute on the basis of discrimination against my beliefs in this space. And so since this time, I've kind of thrown myself into this world, really, because I'm so scared about what's happening out there, particularly for children.
So, for a lot of people, this idea of culture is the boogeyman under the bed. They don't believe that it actually exists, and there's not really ramifications for not towing certain ideologies or like not moving in lockstep with the accepted narrative in whatever category XYZ. Can you kind of explain what get into that discovery? So you were working as a counselor, and you were also going to school for your master's for counseling, correct? Like in psychology. And
Yeah.
there were certain things that were a little bit alarming to you, or maybe you just were questioning. And then I believe you said that you were petitioning the government. Can we get into that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'd been doing voluntary counselling at a children's charity for about 4 or 5 years. I was speaking to a lot of young people who were saying that they were trans or trapped in the wrong body. That's what started getting me increasingly concerned about this. And then on the side, I was doing this master's. I was about to set up a private practice, and it was quite a big step in my career. But I felt that I needed to speak out about it, particularly what was going on in the therapeutic profession, because there's an increasing concern that there's doctors and therapists out there basically encouraging these children to transition medically. I co-founded a group that I'm still a part of today called Thoughtful Therapists. We decided we needed to do something substantial. So I drafted this petition to the UK government because at that time they'd just announced they were going to ban conversion therapy. And there was a real concern amongst myself and colleagues that this was going to criminalise, normal explorative therapy for children with gender dysphoria. So I launched a petition to the government. I did a bit of publicity about the petition, and it was that petition and the publicity that got me expelled.
So when we hear conversion therapy, obviously we're like, no, that is so wrong. primarily because of the way that that was used to, like, I guess, continue the oppression of, gay people or lesbian people or people that didn't fit into like this perfect sexual mold that we said was acceptable in Western culture. Obviously, it's wrong and it doesn't work. It's been proven time and time again. Like, if you're gay, you're gay. Like, you're not going to go to therapy and get rid of that. What is the difference between conversion therapy and just regular explorative therapy as far as like diagnosing someone? Because there is a protocol when you're diagnosing someone. So if I have bipolar and I come in, there's steps to figure out if I am or if I'm not, or if I have body dysmorphia or whatever it might be. So I guess to the lay person, what's the difference between conversion therapy and then just trying to do a general assessment of somebody?
Well, look, conversion, I'm going to call them practices. I'm not going to necessarily use the word therapy, but they do exist. They have existed. They are abhorrent. They don't work anyway. People often think of horrific things that have gone on, such as, corrective rape and electric shock therapy. These things are awful and have happened, and it's shameful that those ever happened. Those practices are already illegal. They're already caught by legislation. The purpose of these conversion therapy bans is in effect to kind of clamp down on talking therapies, the type that a therapist or a counsellor might engage in. But, conversion therapy, unfortunately, is now being used as a synonym for explorative therapy, because what those on the other side are saying is that you must affirm. That's the word that they like to use. And a therapist's job is never to simply affirm what a client is saying. People come to therapists for all manner of mental health conditions, and it's a therapist's ethical duty to explore, to question, even sometimes to challenge, in order to figure out what is in the best interests of the client that they're sat in front of. It's not to simply kind of nod along with whatever the client says to you. You mentioned bipolar. Equally, some people have forms of condition where they've delusional, grandiose thinking. They convince themselves of things that aren't real. A therapist would be breaching their ethical duties if they simply just went along with that thinking. So this is the concern that we've got, that it's going to just criminalize normal therapy that we would do for any other condition.
Yeah, and I believe that's already underway in Canada, where it has to be just simply affirmative care. Are there any repercussions? So I'm scheduling this detransitioner for the podcast. I'm just working with her schedule right now, and she underwent like hormonal therapy and actual surgical manipulation while she was still a minor. And then when she turned 18, she was like, "Whoa, what did I just do?" But there's nothing you can do like that. It's irreversible. So are there steps that you can take? Like, is there litigation that can happen because you were a minor? Because I definitely want to get into consent with you as well, and the idea of that. Like, what are the steps for somebody in that situation?
Well, it depends on the jurisdiction, but we are seeing an increase in potential litigation in this space. There's rumblings that there's going to be some group litigation in the United Kingdom against the Tavistock Centre, which is kind of the clinic under the National Health Service that has been facilitating medical transition for young people. There's talk that there will be a group litigation suit brought against them, and we're waiting to hear the details of that. So there may well be legal routes, but as you just said yourself, the procedures themselves are irreversible. And this is the issue, because we're almost forcing children into making decisions that could end up affecting the rest of their lives. These are decisions that I would argue that as adults we should not be allowing them to make in the first place.
So, the steps of affirmative care, can you kind of walk me through that? So, let's say I bring my child in and my child is prepubescent, we'll say like 10 years old. And I'm like, let's say that it's a daughter and, she knows that she's a boy. So, at 10, like, what are the steps for puberty blockers? And then how does that kind of escalate?
Well, usually there's a form of social transition that's kind of offered up first, and that's described as a kind of softer option. But actually, we know that it sets children down a slippery slope towards further transitioning. But that might be things like changing pronouns, changing name, changing dress, things like that. But studies have shown that if a child starts to live as if they were the other sex, it actually changes the hardwiring in their brain. It makes it less likely they'll become comfortable in their own body. So that's an issue. So you've got the social transitioning, then you've got, as you mentioned, the puberty blockers. The issue here is that a lot of proponents of transitioning say to parents and these young children, well, it's better that they start on the puberty blockers as early as possible, possibly even before they've actually started puberty, because then if they want to go even further with the transition, it will be a lot easier. So you've got this, ridiculous scenario in which children who have never even experienced puberty are being put on these puberty blockers. And if they progress straight from that onto cross-sex hormones later on, they can be left permanently infertile. So yes, puberty blockers can be given at a very young age. Then come the cross-sex hormones. Again, the age that those can be administered depends on the jurisdiction. And then you've got the sex reassignment surgery, as they would call it, whether that's phalloplasties or double mastectomies. In the UK at the moment, you can only get those when you're 18 or above. But I've come across guidance recently from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and they've said that they believe that children of any age should be allowed to receive these surgeries, which is truly shocking.
Whoa. That's really hard to believe or get your head around, because when it comes to understanding the ramifications of any of those decisions, your brain's not even close to being formed yet, to completion. Like, I can't go smoke a cigarette if I'm not 18. Well, I think even now it's 21 for those vapes. So you don't trust me to understand the health consequences of this vape, but you expect a child to understand the health consequences of these drugs that don't have any longitudinal studies.
Mm.
That's nuts to me. And I'm curious, in the process, I don't know if you are familiar with people that are actually like prescribing these to children, but like, do they go over the side effects and the potential risks with the parents, or do they just kind of say, do this, otherwise, your kid might be so depressed that they become suicidal, which is what I had Buck Angel on the podcast years ago, and he says that's like a common tactic, which is like to guilt the parents. Like, it's this horrible quote that you see. It's like, like, would you rather have a son or a dead daughter, or something like that? And it's like, whoa, how dare you? How dare you use that with parents? That's horrific, and that's negligence by any stretch.
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of fear mongering, a lot of manipulation of statistics. You've got that on one side. On the other side, you've got a kind of commercialization of this and almost a glorification of it. I'm increasingly seeing pictures, even of gender clinics, where they've got the surgeon after the operation posing next to this young person with their kind of double mastectomy scars. I can't think of any other type of medical procedure for a serious condition that we would engage in that. And then you've got celebrities as well, increasing numbers of celebrities coming out as trans and then again posing with their scars, etc. Very much sending a message to children and young people that, if you do this, it's all going to be okay. You're going to feel good about yourself. So I do worry that the ramifications are not being explained properly to children. But even if they are explained properly, we come back to this issue of age of consent. And as you've just said, we're allowing children here to make irreversible decisions, even though we don't allow them to buy a lottery ticket or, smoke a cigarette. So to my mind, it doesn't particularly matter whether the clinic explains these things. These children should not be allowed to consent to it at all.
Hey everyone, this is new. So we are taking a quick break for a couple of sponsors. How exciting is that we have a couple sponsors for the podcast? So this is new. Please don't skip it. Just listen. It's cool stuff, I promise. So my first one is a small company called Ragnar's Rocks, and I'll make sure I have the link below. As you know, I love crystals and I get made fun of for it all of the time, but I'm not going to change my ways, and I'm going to stand by it. I truly believe in them, and I think that they're beautiful, so sue me. But he sent me, how incredible is that? He sent me this beautiful amethyst. I've got this really cute rose quartz skull. All of this is on my table. You can't see, but when I start doing two cameras, you'll be able to see my little setup. And this cute little crystal Buddha. How adorable is he? These bracelets are from there. I was really stoked to have him as a sponsor because this is right up my alley. So if you're into any crystals or you just want to check out the website, it's ragnarsrocks.com, and I'll link that below. And the last affiliate, last sponsor, please don't skip. This one's a good one. So we all know the benefits of fasting. Well, my husband and I have used this company, Prolon, actually a couple of times, so I was really excited that they wanted to be an affiliate of the podcast. So if you want to try Prolon, it's a fasting mimicking diet, so you get all the benefits of a water fast, and it's a lot easier because you get this delicious food instead of having to completely eat nothing. So you can try Prolon for $150 with the code Candice. Some of the claims for, and I mean, I say claims, but I'm going off of a script, guys. 60% of people that completed the fast had better energy, mental clarity, and focus. You'll definitely shed some lbs. I felt a ton lighter after doing it. It's cool to do difficult stuff, and obviously fasting is not easy, so it's kind of cool to see how you can kind of push it and get through something that you thought you might not be able to do. It's a lot easier than just doing a water cleanse. And again, I think the average here, people lose an average of 5.7 pounds and 1.6 inches off of their waistline. So as soon as I'm done breastfeeding, I'm doing one of these, and Eric's supposed to be starting anytime now. So we'll see when he decides to start. So I'll link that below. Again, if you want to try Prolon, you can try it for $150. Use code Candice, and let's return to the episode. So why do you think that our idea of consent is so inconsistent? Like, why can I say you can consent to puberty blockers, or you can consent to surgical intervention, at least in some states here, but you can't consent to a tattoo, you can't consent to a beer, you can't consent to having sex with someone, with an adult, right? Like if you want to take it to that extremity. So why is there not more of an alignment with just that simple term?
Well, I mean, pure and simply, the safeguarding has gone out the window. But I think the reason for that is because of this idea of identity and the way in which this has kind of infiltrated society. Because the way it's pushed, particularly by the media and a lot of politicians, is that this isn't a mental health condition. This is just somebody's identity. They almost equate it with things like your race or your religion, And so we're not, we're not medically mutilating people. We're simply allowing them to live in the body that they always should have been born into. And it's a very different narrative, really. And it kind of, as I say, it takes on the same stature as somebody's race. It's almost that it's simply allowing them to be who they always were. I think that's one of the core issues. And so as a result of that, the safeguarding kind of goes out the window because it is completely inconsistent. I mean, we've had debates in the UK over recent weeks around this because in Scotland, they were looking to pass legislation allowing 16-year-olds to legally change their sex. And one of the Scottish politicians came out and said that in their mind, children of the age of 8 should be allowed to legally change their sex. And I was doing some research online of what things 8-year-olds aren't allowed to do. They're not allowed in the UK to set up a bank account, and they're not allowed to create a Facebook account. And yet we're suggesting that they can legally change their sex. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, I was watching a documentary, and this woman was starting, I don't know what, the child was very young, like I would say less than 5, and she was already going to doctor's visits, I guess like to get ready for whatever the next step of intervention was. And I watched this years ago. This is before I was a parent. And initially, I was so emotional and was like, what a good mom to accept her child no matter what. Like, that's kind of where they want to get you, right? Is with the heartstrings. And you're like, she's just, because you hear all these horrible stories about, there's a gay kid and his parents abuse him or don't accept him or kick him out of the house. And you're like, what terrible parents, what terrible parents. So then you see this other example and they're switching their kid's gender, and you're like, well, what a great parent, because they're just accepting the child. They're just like taking the child for whatever it's saying, and and just letting them be unique in their own right. And we're forgetting, like, there still needs to be, like you said, safeguards, right? So there's I don't know, it's a fine line. I feel like a lot of this is so nuanced. You don't ever want to shut a kid down, but I guess to give my own example, my kid's 3 and he still doesn't really understand the difference between boys and girls. Like he's like still kind of getting there, but he calls everyone he. Like that's just what the pronoun that he likes to call everyone. And I'm like, I'm just waiting for the day that he offends somebody by doing that. I'm like, he's 3, you can't take offense. But he doesn't even understand that concept. So now I'm looking back at that documentary and I'm like, whoa, a 3-year-old has no idea what they're saying, right? And these parents are being a little bit negligent. So he was feeling around his body the other day and he was like really pushing at his chest, like his sternum right here. And he's like, why is that so hard? And I was like, oh, there's bones under there. And then he starts playing with his fingers and he's like, why are these so hard? I'm like, there's bones in there. And I was trying to explain the concept of what a bone does functionally. And he's like, oh, I don't like that. And then he had a tantrum and kept telling me to take them out. Like he was so uncomfortable with the idea of something being in his body that he at that time felt was foreign. And obviously this is like an extreme example, but it just showcased that he obviously in that moment had no idea what was good for him because like you will die if you don't have bones in your body. And it showed that like as you become a little bit more online as a child, like you're just getting more body awareness. Like there's so much nuance to that, to development, and a lot of it's going to be strange, especially around puberty. And just because it's uncomfortable or you might not feel at ease, like it's the parent's job to help kind of guide you into like a loving and appreciating your body. And it's not to say that trans people don't exist. I'm very well that they are, and I think adults should be able to do what they want to do with their body and live the life that they want to live so long as they're not imposing on other people. We're talking about kids. So I think it's your job to make them lean into discomfort, appreciate their body. And then I do wonder like how much like are there alternatives to medical intervention when it comes to these kids, whether they actually have dysphoria or whether it's something else? Because a lot of the information I've been reading was suggesting that there is kind of this relationship with autism and the numbers that we're seeing. So again, it's like how much of are there other alternatives? Or are we like, no, we just have to affirm? And the only right answer is that the child knows best.
Hmm. I mean, your story there about your son's throwing up some interesting observations. And, we have to think about human nature in all of this. We know that human beings have a tendency to be very self critical, particularly of their outward appearance. A lot of us, I'm sure there probably isn't a person alive who wouldn't, if they had an opportunity, change some aspect of their body that they feel self conscious about. And then, as your son was kind of intimating, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what's going on inside our bodies. And I think if we think about it too much, any of us might squirm a little bit if we really think about what's happening at any given moment. And, particularly in puberty, I mean, your body is literally changing before your very eyes. You don't quite understand the changes. Some of them might be uncomfortable. You never asked for the changes to take place. So this is, it can be a distressing time for any child. The problem is now the message we're giving to children is, well, if you don't like it, you can change it or you can pause it. Whereas actually, it should be working towards acceptance. I mean, so much of therapy and counselling is around acceptance. Um, in terms of what can be offered as an alternative to medicalising children, well, therapy is very effective because gender dysphoria, is a mental health condition. I always come back to that point again. And so we should treat it, with open explorative therapy as we would for anything else. But actually, just time, it's kind of fallen out of favour a bit. But the old phrase used to be watchful waiting. That's what they used to recommend to parents. Just kind of bide your time and see how it goes, because the statistics show that the vast majority of children with gender dysphoria will settle into their bodies with time. So that's the decision we've got to make here. You either allow children the time and likelihood is they'll settle into themselves, or you start them down a slippery slope towards medicalization before they've even hit puberty.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had Dr. So on the podcast a while back, and she has this like she brings up the point of gender expression being fluid, right? Like that's a spectrum. Like the way that we express our gender is a spectrum. Gender itself is not a spectrum. So it's almost like we're moving backwards from the 90s where we used to say if you are a more masculine woman, then that's totally fine. And if you're a more feminine man, that's totally fine. Like you're allowed to express yourself how you'd like, but like you're still a man and you're still a woman. And it almost seems to be like more prejudice to be like, well, if you are a girl and you like to roll in the mud and play sports and wrestle, then you actually are a boy and you're in the wrong body. Like to me that's way more bigoted than just saying no, you can be both. Like no one is telling you you have to be in a box, and we've kind of gone back to a place where society is trying to put you in a box.
I completely agree. And again, from a therapeutic or even a philosophical point of view, none of us know what it's like to live as another person. We can only ever know what it's like to be inside our own head and our own body. So this idea that a young girl might know what it feels like to be a boy is ludicrous, because they never have been a boy. What they know is what they see boys doing, and what we tend to associate with boys, which tends to be, as we say, kind of stereotypical ideas of what is masculine or feminine. But none of us know what it's like to be in any other body other than our own. So when people come out and say, "I just knew from such a young age that I was trapped in the wrong body," it's not possible.
Mhm. No, and then I always kind of like get to more of like a spiritual take, which is, and I mean, you'd have to figure out like, do you believe in God? All of these other questions, which for the answer for me is yes. So I don't believe. I think that everything happens for a reason, and I think that you're presented with challenges in life that you are meant to overcome and learn from. And I don't necessarily think that the answer to that problem of like vast discomfort in your body is to start chopping it up, right? Like that's an extreme. So again, if you're an adult, absolutely do what you want. Like I don't believe in people getting in the way of that, but I think when it comes to kids, like you're kind of sending the wrong message. Like you're like, okay, we're going to just like take a sledgehammer to this problem instead of delicately trying to navigate it together. Like how can I make you feel at peace with your body? How can I make you feel at peace in general? Not let's do this, use this new technology because we don't really understand. Like when Buck was sharing his story, he was the first, I believe, the first medical, like full medical transition from female to male. And because it was so new, they didn't understand really all of the potential risks and dangers and consequences. So he actually almost died during the process. So that's why he's like, you can't lie about what you are. Because if I had gone in with all of this stomach cramping and I was like, I'm a man, I'm a man, I'm a man, well, they're not going to know that there's a cervix up there that's quite literally atrophying and almost killed me. So again, like we are in this place where we're operating within reality, and you can't completely deny that because it's going to, at the end of the day, like probably be a disservice to yourself and others. But to sit there and it's like this is such like a delicate topic to navigate. It's like you don't want to call people crazy, but there are certain fundamental truths, right? Like there is male and female in biology that exists. Um, and you can have all of the surgeries and that's still not changing anything. And then it's like you pump yourself up with these hormones. And I mean, I don't take testosterone or anything like that, but I've heard that taking testosterone, especially as a woman, can make you feel more confident. It can get rid of anxiety. So how do you know that it's just not like a hormone imbalance? Like, are we doing an intake of a baseline hormone, the baseline of the hormones for these young individuals coming in? Because what if their T is super low? And what if they just need a tiny bit to just get them back to like a regular homeostasis? Instead, we're putting in an unnatural amount into a female body. We're like, well, we hope this doesn't give you cancer later.
Yeah, I mean the risks are huge, and there might be a social element as well, a kind of fake it till you make it. Because if you've been, particularly as a child, if you've been saying for many years, I need this, I want this is who I am, this is the only thing that will make me feel better, and then you kind of come up the other end of having hormones and surgery, and you wake up. And I've spoken to detransitioners about this, but you wake up in the hospital and you think, what the fuck have I just done?
Mm-hmm.
For many, I think it would be quite difficult to row back from that, because I mean, you'd lose a huge amount of face, and also these young people are having to contend with the fact that they made the decision to go ahead with it, and the kind of shame that might be associated with that. So it's so complicated. But I agree with you generally. I mean, not even just from a kind of spiritual point of view, but again, in terms of looking at what is in people's best interest. As a therapist, you want to work towards what is going to be, the least invasive, the least risky option for the client in front of you. If I had an adult client come in to see me, and they said that they didn't like their stomach, they wanted liposuction. My role as a therapist in that would be to work with them to understand what's causing that um, disease in their body, and to look at kind of what their options are, and to see if they can work towards a place, of acceptance. Um, it isn't to just say to them, well, have you considered liposuction?
Right, because that's the surface level issue, right? You're not getting down to the actual root of the problem. So if you were to dig, and that would be your job as a counselor, therapist, coach, whatever position that you have over this person, is to get down to the first principles of that issue. The first principles aren't that you wish you had abs. Like, what else does that mean for you? And I think with affirmative care, again, it's almost like gross negligence, because you're not getting down to those first principles. It's just like, no, okay, you just want to be objectively beautiful, or you just want to XYZ, whatever it is. Like, my nose is too big. Again, like, I want to be 20 pounds lighter. You gave an example, which I think is an interesting one, which is like, this arm isn't mine.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, so do you cut that person's arm because they're telling you it's not their arm? Of course not. That's not in their best interest. Of course not. Like, that is not in alignment with reality. Whether or not they believe that is kind of irrelevant, because you can't chop off someone's arm.
Yeah, and then this brings up, a conversation around how do we know if people are well? How do we know if people are healthy? Because some people might feel a subjective, personal sense of satisfaction. For example, the person you just described who just doesn't feel that their arm belongs to them. If you were to go and chop off their arm, maybe they'll feel better for that in themselves. But we as a society can look at that and say, objectively, that person is not well off. Objectively, that person is not living in reality. And, as part of social care, etc., it is our duty as citizens to help one another if we believe that they're objectively not well off. So, but I think the fixation when it comes to gender identity is, all that matters is somebody's lived experience. All that matters is how somebody feels in themselves, and you shouldn't question or deny that at all.
I mean, even as like a thought exercise, do it yourself. Like, think of how many times you've felt something was utterly true or real, and you were like, wait, no. In hindsight, my thoughts or my feelings were misleading me, misguiding me, because you can get wrapped up and consumed by that very easily, especially if you're not in a good place. So, I mean, the whole idea is to be able to teach your kids, like, you are not your thoughts or your feelings, right? You have to be able to separate yourself from those things. You're just kind of experiencing those things. Do you think that a lot of this, especially with the integration into schools, is like an overcorrection for like bullying and those long-term consequences?
I think everything that's going on in the world today around identity politics is a kind of overcorrection in terms of wrongs that happened in the past that we shouldn't ignore and forget about, because we as human beings have been pretty damn nasty to certain groups in our society over time.
Mm-hmm.
But we've swung far too far the other way now, to the point that people are terrified of raising concerns, including concerns around child safeguarding, because they fear being labelled, as a bigot or as hateful or something like that. So there's been a real kind of shutting down of free and open thinking in this space because of that, and it's not good. And where does it end? I find with a lot of these movements, and I think we can draw comparisons between gender ideology and critical race theory, for example. But where does it end? Because these individuals' life mission is to campaign and bring more change. to the point that I don't think they can allow themselves to get to a point where they actually look around and say, okay, things are good now as they are. We've achieved our mission. Because then they'd have no purpose. They'd probably have no job either. So, I often hear from kind of trans activists and proponents of gender ideology and even critical race theorists, they say things have never been so bad. And actually, if you look back over the history of humankind, things have never been so good.
Yeah, it's all the perspective that you're choosing to take. I think it was Steven Pinker that does that, and he's like, actually, we've never experienced such peace.
Yeah,
Like, it might feel like that, and a lot of that is what you're consuming, like, your internal environment, and then also your external environment that a lot of us are just choosing to put ourselves in. Like, you're throwing yourself into Twitter for 4 hours a day, and then you think everything is on fire. Well, no, like, close your laptop, turn off your phone, and go walk outside, and you'll realize that reality is much different than the actual one that's being experienced by most people.
I completely agree. I mean, look, I use Twitter far more than I should.
Me too.
But yeah, I mean, look, it is addictive. I can't get away from that. But technology is not helping. I think children growing up these days, are a lot less open to those kind of experiences. They're a lot more turned inwards. They're a lot more dependent on technology. I also think I hate the word privilege and the way it's kind of being used these days. But I actually think that privilege is relevant for this conversation because we live in a very privileged position indeed if we're able to spend the amount of time we are ruminating and thinking and reflecting in our minds, and analyzing everything about ourselves. Because you can be sure that, people in war-torn countries or struggling in, the depths of poverty are not worried about their pronouns.
Mm-mm.
So I think it tells us a lot about the society that we're living in today, actually, that we have this kind of fixation. I mean, we've all basically become kind of like self-obsessed. And it's not good.
No, so I guess moving forward, where are you at with your situation? Because we mentioned diversity, and what I always find fascinating is this is a mantra that so many people say, but when it comes to diversity of thought, we have zero tolerance. We talk about tolerance, we talk about diversity, but it has to be within these very fine parameters of the people that are in charge. So you can't have diversity of thought. Again, you have to kind of move lockstep. Where was I going? Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Um, so when it comes to intolerance, and then when it comes to tolerating people that kind of descend, like there doesn't seem to be a lot of that either. So someone in your position that lost their job and lost I mean, you got kicked out of university. Like that's where you're supposed to go to think and kind of like tackle big ideas. Like where do you go? What can you do?
I mean, it's pretty terrifying. Of all places that should have free and open debate, it's educational institutions. And I wasn't going around shouting abuse, swearing, being aggressive, shutting people down. I was simply saying I've got some concerns about children. Can we talk about it? So the fact that I was expelled for that really is quite concerning. It's going to take litigation, unfortunately, to kind of teach these organisations that they can't get away with this. And I've had a lot of students reach out to me who have said that they've put their training on hold pending the outcome of my case because they're too scared that the exact same thing is going to happen to them as well. So it's unfortunate, but I think probably more people will need to be cancelled until this actually shifts. We need to try and create a bit of a wave of people feeling confident enough to speak out. But even within the debate now, there's still people trying to cancel each other. And, it's something that I struggle with because I think I got into this to speak about children. There are significant issues around the impact on women's rights, safe spaces for women, fairness in sports, etc. And I do spend a lot of time thinking and talking about those because they're also important. But I find that there's quite a lot of women's rights activists who will basically say to me, shut up and stay out of it because you're a man and this doesn't concern you. And I don't get the benefit of that. We're kind of on the same side here. And when it comes to children's well-being, that's everyone's concern, men and women alike. So I don't see why this happens, and I think it's a shame this happens. I would like it if everyone was able to focus on the important issues of the time. But generally today, as we said earlier, we live in a kind of world of identity politics where one's identity is kind of the most important thing about them. But I don't go into these conversations particularly thinking, I am a man. I'm just, I'm a human who's got concerns, and I want to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think shutting down an entire group of people or placing a pejorative on you, like all men are bad, or whatever those talking points are, I think that's nonsense, and it's just like it's a lazy way to try to win an argument. I think everyone is allowed to have an opinion, especially if it's something that affects your space, right? Like you exist in this world, you're allowed to have an opinion. And historically, like it is a man's job, quote, quote, and this is, gonna flare some people up, but it is a man's job to protect children, to protect women, to be a leader. So to be like, you're a man, you can't you can't have a seat at the table. Imagine if someone said that to you because you're a woman, which has happened throughout history. You're a woman, you can't vote. You're a woman, you can't have an opinion. That wasn't okay. So why is it okay to do it to men? I think everyone has the right to share their opinion, their reality. um I don't know, I think.
I agree. But again, similar to what we were saying a few moments ago, I think it's kind of overcompensation because women historically have been shut out of the conversation, and I'm very glad to see that they are speaking up. And thankfully, there's a lot of strong women out there, a lot of strong women's rights groups who are really raising awareness of these issues, and I'm glad for that. But when it comes to representing children, the more voices, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that you need that balance. I think that there's gonna be ways that we tend to show up to issues and problems. So, for example, when I was watching that documentary, like all of these like social issues are kind of geared towards women because we tend to be more feelers. It's just whether you want to get into biology or it's cultural or that's irrelevant. We just tend to be more feelers, and men tend to be better at like kind of like separating their emotions and then being able to kind of look at things. That's been my experience. So if I go into something highly emotional, I can usually trust that if my husband comes in and he's like, well, let's pump the brakes on this a little bit and like look at it from this vantage point, I'll be like, oh, I didn't see that. And then I can start trying to like wrestle with whatever thought experiment that it is. So I think you definitely need that balance. Like you need that yin and that yang, and to like again shut off an entire sex and say you're not welcome at the table or allowed to show us what you see. I think we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Yeah, I mean, look, men and women are very similar in some ways, but we're very different in other ways. I mean, that's actually kind of the whole point of the argument here, is that there is a difference between sexes. So, yeah, if we want as much kind of diversity of thought, then I think men and women need to be, cooperating together on this. So it's I find it a kind of ongoing frustration, but I'm not going to stop speaking out about it because it's too important. But I just wish we could focus on the issue at hand, and not get bogged down in this. So yeah, I yeah, I didn't choose to be a man any more than anyone else chose to be a woman. At the end of the day, I'd like us to all treat each other with kind of I mean, we're striving for equality, aren't we? And actually, a lot of the people who are high up in organizations who are kind of pushing this gender ideology and facilitating it are men, right? So I want to be able to speak to as many men as possible. I'm trying to encourage more men to speak out about these issues. Um, and I think if men are afraid to speak out because they think they're going to be shut down and told to stay out of it, then I think that's a real issue for all of us.
Hmm. No, I couldn't agree more. And especially if you have kids, it's like if you have a boy, is that how you want him to be treated in the future? Do you want him to not have a seat at the table? Do you want him to be dismissed simply because of, you know, who he came into this world as? I don't think that that's fair either. I guess any piece of advice for parents, like if you see some of these ideologies being taught to your little one in school, like at what point is it worth setting up a meeting with the staff? At what point is it worth maybe getting vocal, trying to talk to other parents? Like when is it you making a mountain out of a molehill,
Yeah.
or is it all something to be concerned about?
Well, I think given the way things are at the moment, particularly in education, that parents need to be proactive around considering what their children are being taught. Because I've had a lot of parents come to me and say that they had absolutely no idea that their child was being taught these materials until years later, sometimes even after the child has left school. And it's only once they began asking questions, asking to see materials, etc., that they discovered what was happening. And it's a shame that it's come to that, because parents should be able to entrust their children to schools. But these are the times we're living in. So I'd encourage parents to kind of be proactive in that respect, because so much of this is being drip fed in schools. If a child is coming home saying that they're feeling that they're trapped in the wrong body, it puts parents in a very difficult position. And I don't have kids myself, so I can only base this on conversations I've had with others and what I can imagine it would feel like. But as best as possible, to try and strike the right balance. Because again, I've spoken to parents who said that they were so fearful of their child hurting or killing themselves that they kind of went completely along with it, and their child went down this medical pathway and now regrets it, and the parent feels guilty for the rest of their lives. And I've spoken to other parents who came down really strongly and said, none of this. They didn't even entertain a conversation with the child. Under no circumstances are you doing this. And that child became alienated from the family, went to university, stopped speaking to the parents, and has transitioned anyway. And now they've got no contact with each other, and that's not good. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's about making sure that children feel empathized with, that they feel listened to and understood, but that as a parent, as an adult, you have safeguarding at the front of your mind, and reminding children that they still haven't got everything figured out, even though they might think they do. And that as an adult, you have more life experience to go on, because I don't know, it's almost the impossible we're asking of parents in many ways. It's such a fine line to balance, but I would avoid extreme reactions one way or the other, because we know the implications that can have.
No, that's a really good piece of advice. Mm-hmm. Well, James, I hope, like we said before we started recording, that this will not be relevant in years to come, and we'll look back and be like, I can't believe that we were doing all of that, and let's protect our kids a little bit more, and a lot of it more. And that everyone, I don't know, ask questions. I think that's the big thing, is ask your kid questions. Every day when my kid comes home, I'm like, what'd you guys talk about? What'd you learn today? So just, it's extreme presence, and love your kid.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it, and I want to share your optimism. I'm not sure whether I do, because I tend to be pessimistic anyway. But there have been some positive changes, particularly in the United Kingdom over recent times. So I hope that we as a community, as a society, can come together and actually think, what have we done, and just start putting children first in all of this, because it pains me, the thought, every day that goes by, there are more and more children suffering and potentially being placed down these pathways towards, eternal regret. And sometimes that becomes quite overwhelming, because I think, God, we need to sort this out today, but it's not going to be sorted out today, because this is an ideology that's kind of spread around the entire globe. So we just need to kind of chip away at it, one step at a time. And it could take a while, but I hope in the end we get there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do as well. Before we head out, James, do you want to tell people where they can follow you? You can, plug anything you're working on or any resources.
Sure. Yeah. As I said earlier, I'm kind of addicted to Twitter, so you'll find me on there, which is it's just my name. I've got a Substack, which I also link to on my Twitter, where I write kind of weekly articles about this issue. And then I've got my crowdfunding page for my litigation, which is still ongoing, and I'm going to need to raise more money to see it through to the end. That's on Crowd Justice. So if you type James Esses Crowd Justice into Google, you'll be able to donate if you'd like to.
Well, thank you so much, and I'll make sure I link all of that at the bottom for everybody. Again, I wish you the best of luck, and thank you so much for, sharing your story and making a difference.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.
That's all for this week's episode of Chatting with Candice. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to hit that like, subscribe, and if you have the time, leave a review. The best way that this podcast can grow it through the algorithms is hitting the subscribe button and also reviews. So that would mean a lot to me as we're still growing and on this journey together. I'll see you next time. That's all for this week's episode of Chatting with Candice. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to hit that like, subscribe, and if you have the time, leave a review. The best way that this podcast can grow it through the algorithms is hitting the subscribe button and also reviews. So that would mean a lot to me as we're still growing and on this journey together. I'll see you next time.